Hi, I'm Chappington, and welcome back to Skrælige. This is Chapter 6. When we left off, it was 1598, and the Skræligans had agreed to make an oath of fealty to King Christian IV of Denmark, and also of Norway. So they held a feast for the expedition, and they celebrated the beginning of a new future. And after a few days of recovery and restocking, most of the Danes made the journey back home, although 22 of them elected to stay in Skrælige. And then in early 1599, an additional 100 arrived, along with new colonial governor Egil Christiansen. The first priority was to begin the recording of the current state of Skrælige, which meant commissioning a folk telling, just like the mantles before, and this was completed by 1600. What they found is, in the past 50 years, even with the new immigration, the total population of Skrælige had decreased and was now 846. As part of the folketelling, some of the names of the towns were changed to be in Danish rather than the Skræligen language. So, for example, Niveen was now Nihabe, Midtunga was now Midtunga, Nordsted is now Nordsted, and there are a few other name changes as well. So after that was done, though, the big change for Skrælige was religion. The Protestant Reformation had spread throughout Europe in the 16th century, and that included Denmark, Norway. They had converted their state religion to Lutheranism in 1536 and 37, and the last part of the realm to convert was Iceland, which did so from 1539 to 1550. Skrælige was still Catholic, although its isolation meant that its doctrines weren't 100% in line with the papacy anyway. And until coming under the crown of Denmark, the ideas of the Reformation hadn't really made it to Skrælige, as their only contact to the outside world was via the Spanish. There wasn't really that much opposition to the religious change. The main change was in the religious language, and what little Latin had been used was now completely gone, replaced with Danish and Skræligen. There are a few Danish Bibles brought over, and work began on a Skræligen translation. Real conflict began in 1600 after the folketelling was completed. With a thorough compilation of all the property on the islands, Governor Egil Christiansen seized all the church property on behalf of the king. Most of the churches on the islands reluctantly agreed, but Archbishop Jens E. Carlsen fled across the Sigwan River to the church in Nordsted. The fight with the Danish officials carrying out the seizure led to the church being burned down, and the archbishop was executed. While the imposition of Lutheranism was only strongly opposed by a small minority, the next royal act became much more controversial. So, after a monopoly on external trade in Iceland was imposed in 1602, Denmark enacted a similar set of laws for Skrælige. All trade would be controlled by one merchant family, who happened to be friendly with the governor, and would only go straight to Copenhagen. So all the trade with the Spanish territories was banned. Trade with any other nearby territories was similarly banned. This was pretty painful because for nearly a century now, the only external trade had been with the Spanish territories, and now it had to make the much more arduous journey east across the North Atlantic. And while some smuggling south did occur, the Skræligans didn't really have a choice but to comply. Being part of Denmark's empire was supposed to bring them prosperity, and this was the necessary cost of business. But over the next few decades, other European colonies started popping up, which we'll get to later. Despite the new European colonies nearby, the Skræligans were unable to take advantage of the trade opportunities, and were still stuck trading just with Denmark. This kind of began to set a theme where generally when the Thing was in charge, The Skræligans were at least being listened to, even if the important leaders of the thing were better off than the general population. But now the Crown of Denmark showed no real signs of caring about the well-being of the Skræligans. This set up the conflict between the old Skrælige and the absolutism of Denmark. As I mentioned previously, the European powers started to move in nearby. After an unsuccessful attempt at settling St. Croix Island in 1604, the French founded Port Royal on modern-day Nova Scotia the next year. After an English attack in 1613, it was temporarily abandoned, but then later moved upstream, and today it's known as Annapolis Royal. This part of New France became known as Acadia, and eventually expanded to the other side of the Bay of Fundy, around modern-day St. John, New Brunswick. English settlement, though, was a lot closer, including the failed Popham colony in 1607, just across the Northern Strait from the islands of Skrælige, and the first successful English settlement nearby was Plymouth in 1620. More settlements followed. The main first settlements are labelled on the map. By the 1630s, English settlements stretched north to the other side of the Skræligen Sea. There was minimal conflict, though, thanks to the construction of some pretty significant fortifications in Skrælige. That was enough to ward off any English raids. There was the potential for conflict looming, though, because the charter for the Massachusetts Bay Colony was unclear about whether it claimed Skrælige for itself. The Massachusetts Bay government claimed it, but wasn't able to act on this yet. With new immigration and the new leadership, the demand for more construction came up as well. Most of the urban buildings in Skrælige were built in the 14th century or earlier, since demand for housing disappeared with the isolation and migration into the surrounding countryside in the 15th century, and plummeted with the introduction of the European plagues in the 16th century. Along with new half-timbered construction, new architectural styles arrived as well. Tall Baroque buildings, often referred to as Copenhagen houses in Skrælige, stood out with their bright colors among the more subdued whites and browns of the older constructions. One major new landmark in Skrælingborg was the governor's residence, built between the church, the old Great Hall, and the Thing building. Completed by 1603, this was now the clearest sign of Denmark's presence in Skrælige. The structure holding the Thing had already been dwarfed by other buildings in the city, but was now clearly in the shadow of the new seat of power. While the residence was not substantially larger, it was much more ornate and modern, and the Thing began to look dilapidated in comparison. And here on screen you can see the changes in Skrælingborg from 1598 to 1645. The last new construction of note was a new church in Nordsted after the burning of the old church in 1600. After many delays and disagreements, the church was finally completed by 1619, and now that this was the largest church in Skrælige, the Bishop of Skrælige, the new head figure of the church, moved across the Sigwan River to Nordsted, and this became the religious capital. So this is the time-lapse of building the new church in Nordsted, or more accurately, the developments after that, because the church is already built. So just putting in some more half-timbered houses here. The development here isn't really in the middle so much as it's kind of just spread out along. There's some in the middle, but kind of spread out along the main road as well. And later on we'll be going to the dock area where the settlement, where there's more construction there too. Oh yeah, right now. Using one of these strict toasted docks again. I wish there were better, wooden dock areas to use, but this works. So this is pretty much just a repeat of what we did last episode on the other side of the river. And then the other thing is you'll probably notice the way the water is set up here. It goes, it's not a tidal effect, but it goes in and out a lot. So I made the terrain a bit deeper there so there could at least be a little bit of water there. I kind of explained that in the story as like, oh, well, it's just the river is particularly fierce, but that's the real reason. City Skylines logic. And adding some more of the Copenhagen houses here. The houses that they are modeled after in Copenhagen didn't actually exist yet. I think they were like a few more decades after this part in Skrælige, but I really liked them, so I used them anyway. A little bit of artistic license, but I think that'll be okay. And then there's the before and after from 1598 to 1645. On top of those domestic constructions, the biggest project was the Star Fort of Christianborg, named after King Christian IV. The existing fortifications on Skrælige were designed for protection against the Abenaki and were not suited to defending against the European powers moving in nearby. Some initial fortifications were built at the mouth of the Siguen River in the early years of Danish rule, but the outbreak of the 30 Years' War meant that more substantial fortifications might be required. Construction of Christianborg began in 1625, and the final structures were completed by 1630. The fort never actually saw battle during the 30 Years' War, though, instead just warding off potential attacks. All of the Danish warfare was instead limited to the European continent, which was to the great relief of the Skræligans. So what you've been seeing on screen is me putting together the Star Fort of Christianborg, using the, I think it's like the Citadel of Lille or something. So this was kind of common. I think the idea was by putting all the angles in, it was hard to like have cannons shoot straight on at the walls, which was the easiest way to take them down. So by always making it at an angle, cannonballs would deflect off of the wall. They'd be more likely to deflect and wouldn't take the full blast. So here, the thing I should mention is I originally started building this way too big. And then the final product, I'll be like halfway through, I'll finally realize, oh, this is way too big, and cut it down in size. So just be aware that I'm building this out right now, like too big and then shrinking it down. But you get to see the mistakes in my creative process as well. So just building some extra exterior earthworks, kind of making the terrain play nice with the walls, because these are props and not like networks. Like, they're definitely an older asset, so because of that there's still a little bit of finagling to do with it, with the lining up the walls. It's now starting to mess with the roads, and most of the roads I have to name just to keep track of everything. And then one of the things is, a lot of the time I do this time-lapse build with the night cycle on. If that gets really annoying to see, just let me know. I can stop doing that. I just like it for myself. So now we got to build the moat. Let's get a channel of water going through there. The bridge will come later and we can finish up that moat area. And then there's a brief little intermission here because I had been using the fishing system there. I made this map before realizing exactly how it works, so there's only like 2 types of fish you can get, but I have the fishing boats running, and one of them got stuck in the fort. And setting up the internal roads here. A little circle, not a roundabout, because, well, there's no modern traffic now, but a little circle. Pop a statue in there. And when we start putting down the buildings, that's when I finally realized that this is way too big. Part of it is just like the scale is off for the time, because it's not like this is some huge major fort. And like because it's so big, it's harder to detail too, because then there'll be just big open spaces that look off. And then also, like, I tried adding some of those Copenhagen buildings as like, oh, there might be like a little bit of development inside the walls, because I needed something to fill the space. But so now I'm downsizing everything, kind of taking one straight piece out of each side, and then have to, because it's props and that height is relative to the terrain, there's a lot of moving and adjusting. So I'm getting that done. And I'm trying to see if I can get away with just using Move It to move everything. But it looks like it's going to be a little bit of a mess, so I end up just deleting the roads and rebuilding them. And we get our statue moved into the middle, and now we can start moving the buildings back. And now they actually start to look like they fit in, rather than just being open, isolated, like just in the middle of nowhere. And then of course, after moving everything, gotta fix up the terrain again. Then here's a little bit where just using PO, because the front gate, if you actually look at the details, it becomes obvious that, oh, this is from France, so kinda needed to cover that up. I mean, not that anyone would notice, but I would notice, so it had to be cleared up. And then now, trying to add some props, adding some clutter. There's probably room for more. Like, there's definitely more that I could have done in terms of, like, if there were more props available for, like, if there were more Star Fort related props, but that's pretty niche for City Skylines. And I'm setting up the cannons, just to point away from the towns. get some more cannons in the middle there. And there's a little bit here where I'm just searching for what props do I have and figuring out what fits. And that's pretty late when I realized, oh, these Copenhagen houses don't really fit in. So I had more of the barracks buildings instead. And then the last main thing is setting up a retaining wall on the other side, because putting those fortification walls doesn't really fit in, because we don't want to have a fortification against the fortification. So I'm just looking for a key wall that looks old but doesn't have too much modern stuff in it, because there's a lot of the old town walls, but they also have lights on them, but that's kind of a giveaway that they don't belong. Then we just finish up a couple extra buildings. And then we get the before and after time lapse. There was some military action in Skrælige, however, just not part of the 30 Years' War. In 1632, the Danish military launched a so-called scouting party inland to the interior of the island to scout out defensible areas to expand to. However, it was really more accurate to call it an invasion of the Sigwan River Valley, and it wasn't even pretending to try to exist peacefully with the Abenaki. Instead, it raided a nearby major village. Many were killed, and the new village, proclaimed for the original governor Eagle, named Eaglestead, was founded on the ruins. Controversially, even for the time, many Abenaki were kidnapped into slavery as well. Slavery hadn't been present on the island for centuries, and the capture of slaves during war wasn't practiced on the island, but this was a common practice on the mainland English colonies, and the Danish authorities saw no reason not to do the same. This began a bit of a abolition movement, and it's the predecessor to the more modern Skræligen abolition movement. And while the Skræligen locals had no power to stop this at a government level, there was a significant number of Abenaki slaves that escaped with the covert help of the locals. This became enough of a problem that the market shifted to importing African slaves instead, and the first documented trade of an African slave in Skrælige occurred in 1639, 1 year after the first African slave trade in New England. While the Skræligans had lived alongside the Abenaki in the past, and there was a small amount of mixing between the two cultures, this wasn't the case for the African slaves. And so, while the opposition to Abenaki slavery had been largely because these were people the Skræligans knew, the African slavery, while not supported, was not strongly opposed for these reasons either. And this unfortunately led to the reimposition of slavery for quite a while. Over on the other side of the Atlantic, the 30 Years' War was devastating the continent. What originally began as a religious conflict between Protestants and Catholics within the Holy Roman Empire eventually morphed into a massive conflict throughout the continent and spilling over even outside of Europe as well, and was no longer strictly on religious lines. Denmark had intervened from 1625 to 29 against the Holy Roman Empire, and then was involved again from 1643 to 45, when the Swedes invaded Denmark in the Torstenson War. The conflict concluded for Denmark in 1645 with the Peace of Brömsebro, which transferred some Danish lands over to Sweden. And this marked the end of the Danish being the major power in the region. As part of the peace treaty, Skrælige was also given to Sweden and would now be administered as part of New Sweden. This was a little bit odd for Skrælige to get used to because, at least when they joined Denmark, it was ostensibly their choice, and now they were just being handed over to Sweden by a treaty. But they were hopeful that a government based closer to home in Fort Christina, present-day Wilmington, Delaware, would at least allow them some more autonomy. So that was Chapter 6 of Skrælige. My plan is to get Chapter 7 out by the end of the year. We'll see how that goes. But yeah, let me know what you think, and have a good one.